When you see this $10 bill, how much do you think it's worth? If I gave each of you $10 right now, what would you buy with it? Coffee, tea, chai, boba, maybe matcha. When you see this $10 bill, you see it for its face value and what it could return for you. The same amount of money can be worth different things to different people based on backgrounds, intentions, privileges. Value changes based on different lived experiences, perceptions, and needs. If I gave each of you $10 right now, would you spend it? Would you save it? I think some of you would even invest it. But we come down to one principle. Worth is determined by how an individual perceives its limitations. Let's use gold as an example. Gold is worth more than water in terms of price, but water is essential to live. And because water is abundant and does not carry the same social value as gold, society places a higher price on gold. But let me tell you one thing, folks. Rarity does not define your value. Being one in a million does not make you valuable. And just because no one else sees your worth does not make you worthless. But what makes you valuable is understanding your lived experiences, realizing your power, and being unapologetic about your truth. But gold and water, they're not the only things we ascribe value to. We do ascribe value to ourselves. And as I've walked my journey in rediscovering my own worth, I've come to realize certain factors make up this sense of worth. Normally, the value that we ascribe to ourselves is based on our culture, our environment, the views of those around us. I'm Filipino. I was expected to study and work in the medical field, to play basketball, to sing and dance just like Bruno Mars. Now, I'm not saying I can't play basketball. I'm not saying I can't sing nor dance, but I did begin to ask myself, I began to question, am I happy with this image of me? Is this what I want to amount myself to? Is this my ceiling in life? And let me ask you, do you folks in the crowd actually want to study your current major, pursue the career that you're currently chasing? Is this the only path that you believe you're capable of walking? But most importantly, are you genuinely happy? Have you ever once stopped to think about what it is that you want? Are you making decisions based off your own desires? Or is your portrait lifeless? Because each of you has your own story. Each of you has your own lived experiences, something that no one else can ever take away from you, and that's your identity. Your identity are the circumstances, experiences, and decisions that shape who you are. And no, you cannot always pick the circumstances you're born into, but you can decide to choose how you value them. I was born thousands of miles away in the Philippines to two young parents who, at the time, were younger than some of you in the crowd today. My mother preparing to graduate college, my father recently completed his degree, but both of them were determined to give me a life that they never knew, a life where they would become doctors, but ultimately had to give up that dream to provide and raise a son. They left behind their friends, their families, everything they knew to give me an opportunity to dream a life where I did not need to experience struggle the same way they did. But in doing so, they worked days and nights. I was raised by my grandparents. They went through a separation and a divorce, and both of them had their own journeys to walk through, all while raising a son at the age of 22 and 23. So let me be clear. I don't blame my parents for experiencing life for the first time. They, like you and like me, are only human, trying to figure everything out. And this is the immigrant story we don't often talk about. This is the identity so many of us in this room work so hard to navigate. And yet, I choose to believe we are more than our circumstances. I'm not only an immigrant, I'm a multi-ethnic Asian with a Filipino and Chinese heritage. English was not my first language. I'm a proud Gen Z from a working class family. I grew up in the Bronx. I went to high school in Queens. I went to college in Long Island. And I worked my first ever job at Queens Center Mall when I was 15 years old. And I tell you this because this is my resilience. This is my story, my identity, and this is my lens into the world. And it's a story that's not just unique to me. It's a story shared by you and you and you. It's a story of so many of us in the room because it's our story. But what we often don't talk about is the other half of this great journey. The times when we stumble, when we fall, when we question, when it feels like all we could ever do is survive. Growing up as an immigrant, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be Asian or American. Being multi-ethnic, I wasn't sure, and I was torn if I was supposed to be Filipino or Chinese. Growing up in a working class family, I've been working since I was 14 and I still need to be financially conscious. Speaking multiple languages, I was labeled with a speech impediment. And being Gen Z, my feelings were not often, but always dismissed and invalidated by others. I began to measure my worth by living a life that would be approved of by my friends, family, society, and all the stereotypes that defined who I should be. And I began to define my value by how others wanted to define my identity. And although my parents never did directly pressure me to pursue medicine, they would passively allude to it, giving me science kits as a child, having me work at nursing homes, asking me about jobs with security and generous pay. My friends, they would reinforce that stereotype by studying medicine or asking me why I chose not to. They believed it was the only acceptable industry, the only way to be successful. It was as if my life was consumed by a combination of passive-aggressive influences and overt pressures. And it was as though my perceived success was a currency, a way to make good on my parents' sacrifices and a currency to keep social order in place. Because when it came to selecting colleges, I focused not only on the top programs to study medicine, the best schools to become a doctor. I didn't even realize that I was letting go of what I truly valued. And what I valued was helping people. I valued autonomy. I valued fighting for what's right and not being constrained to live a life that everyone else was creating for me. I valued self-fulfillment, and I valued myself. But in college, I was a pre-med, and I studied calculus. Honestly, it was the bane of my existence. I would show up late, I would leave early, I would even skip class. But I did chat with my professors. I handed in my homework, and I completed my exams on time. And on the day of my final, within 15 minutes, I handed in my exam. My peers were in admiration, and I walked out with a deep sense of relief. Little did they know, the only thing I had written on my exam was, Clifford Robin Temprosa, I appreciate you, professor. I did the exact same thing on my chemistry and biology finals. I had dropped out of my program, and for the first time in my life, I had felt liberated. And I know what you're thinking, though, with those claps, right? It looks and sounds so easy, but honestly, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go from here. I was immensely afraid. I remember having anxiety about not knowing what I would do after college. And I began working at a healthcare startup, but I was still deeply unfulfilled. And then the pandemic happened. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and Stop Asian Hate movements were at their peaks. Racial and gender justice was on the line. Being a member of Asian fraternity and sorority life, I saw how social media warriors and cancel culture became prominent avenues of moral prerogative. But I wanted to do more, to see more, to go beyond the normalcy of activism. And this was my awakening. I remember wanting to attend riots and protests. My parents were deeply adamant that I stayed home. And so I had to channel my energy and actions in a different method. I volunteered as a food pantry coordinator at a school in Washington Heights for a week, which led me to contacting local government officials to volunteer at their PPE relief and food giveaways, which led me to meeting my local assembly member who, within 3 weeks of volunteering, offered me a job at her office. And I worked for her for the next 3 years and throughout college. And when she announced her senatorial campaign, I took a lead role. And today she's a sitting New York State senator. For years, my professors would warn their students, do not pull a Clifford. And really, what they meant by that was to box yourself in, to keep your head down, to get through the courses and not liberate yourself from the expectations of others. When I was going into college, my parents told me 2 things. Don't change your major, don't join a fraternity. I joined a fraternity and changed my major. I told them by picking them up from the airport on their way home from their wedding in the Philippines, which I was also a part of, but I did leave early to complete my new member education. I was decked out in Greek letters, beanie, sweatshirt, and jacket. I was hoping they would be happy and surprised. I read the situation very, very poorly. We got in the car, and I told them I was going to change my major. And when they told me to rethink and reconsider my decision, I told them I signed the papers last week. Once again, I read the situation poorly. And then I had to tell them I had failed my first semester of college with a 2.1 GPA. I was at risk of losing my financial aid and scholarship, which covered about 90% of my tuition. Folks, I have a life lesson for you. If you have bad news to break to your parents, do not do it coming home from JFK. I promise you the traffic really makes it awkward. But easily, it was two of the best decisions I had ever made in my life. I graduated with a degree in international business. I minored in civic engagement. I maintained my scholarship and financial aid. I graduated within 3 years with a 3.8 GPA while working full-time in government, running multiple nonprofit operations and facilitating political and advocacy campaigns. 2 years later, my classmates would tell me, "We believe that you were academically gifted because you were Chinese." Their assumption rooted in stereotype. They believed that because of my race and my ethnicity, I was just expected to excel. And my worth, in their eyes, was defined by surface-level assumptions, by expectations, simply because of how I looked. Don't get me wrong, when I stopped pursuing medicine, I did feel liberated, but I was also forced to confront the ways in which my perception of self-worth was intertwined with what I had thought others' expectations were of me. And I wouldn't be standing here in front of all of you today if I hadn't broken past that limitation. And as humans, we look to find value, but we struggle to create a sense of it that isn't already predominated by how others see us. And I did not use calculus to become a doctor, but it did give me a framework in evaluating my own worth. And I promise you, it's the only definition you'll ever need to define it. If you've ever had to endure calculus or algebra, you might remember the equation y equals mx plus b. If you know or remember the equation, I want you to consider it in the context of your life where mx is defined by the changing variables of life and b is a fixed constant in life. And reimagine this equation. Y, or your worth, is equal to or defined by the variable of how others see you plus the constant of how you see yourself. Unfortunately, I do believe society has normalized a different equation. In this equation, we're not defined by a true constant, but by a conditioned constant, a conditioning of how people in society deem your worth already to be. In this equation, the constant of how you see yourself is already dominated by the variable of how others see you. And I really was living this life when I was studying and pursuing a medical career, because I was living someone else's definition of success. True leadership and true innovation, it occurs when an individual surpasses any variable of worth and limitation set by the critics and sets their own constants and variables themselves. Success is nothing tangible. That's what goals are for. Success is waking up, loving what you do, being happy, and having the money come in time, rather than waking up with all the money in the world and asking yourself, what am I doing here? Am I even happy? This led me to working 3 years in the New York State Legislature under my mentor, Senator Natalia Fernandez. I built grasshoppers relationships. I fought for public power across New York. I learned how to navigate the political landscape, but most importantly, I saw how power dynamics and broken systems eroded social safety nets and failed New Yorkers who needed them most. But I believe that when we reimagine our self-worth, we can reimagine the limitations of our society. Taking on a fiscal policy role at the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families, I led a portfolio of over 100 API nonprofits and securing over $60 million in public funding. I developed a grassroots consciousness. I saw intersectionality in social justice. I supported dozens of nonprofits in their missions to provide culturally responsive and linguistically accessible social services so that our most marginalized and social welfare can be bridged by people who look like us, who have lived our stories, and can speak our languages. But most importantly, I witnessed how when we make a decision to take a stand, we can influence people in power. Because when we reimagine our self-worth, we demand people in power to look at us differently. Becoming a voice for political power for API communities, I recognized intergenerational hopes and fears. I saw how systemic inequities barred our friends and families from making their voices known at the polls. And I developed an innate sense of gratitude for each and every experience in the room. Because when we reimagine our self-worth, we illuminate the stories and the truths of all those who have been forced to be silenced. Because when we reimagine our self-worth, we empower ourselves and others to carve their own paths to success. Life, it's not about having it all together right now. No one ever does. It's about knowing your worth in the face of adversity, in the face of struggle, reality, expectation, and self-doubt. So, when you look at this $10 bill, how much do you think it's worth? What would you buy with it? How do you want to spend the value of the rest of your lives? It's your choice. And so I invite you in reclaiming your worth and redefining your own success beyond face value. Thank you.